George Crile is here. He is a longtime producer for the CBS News program 60 Minutes and 60 Minutes 2. In 1988, Crile profiled U.S. Congressman Charlie Wilson in a segment for 60 Minutes. At the time, Wilson was working to provide the CIA with hundreds of millions of dollars to fund Afghanistan in their fight against the Soviet Union. Here is a look at that 60 Minutes piece.
Congressman, Afghanistan is a long way from Texas, no matter how you measure it. How did you wind up at this table? What started it all?
Harry, it was, it started when I read on the telex machines that the Soviets were taking casualties in Kabul from stones and knives. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that they, by God, were going to fight. We didn't make the decision for them to fight. But after they made the decision to fight to the end, no matter what they had, then I said we just simply can't allow people this brave and this deserving to sell their lives cheaply.
This is before you met any of them?
It's before I met them. And after I met them, then I thought, you know, these people could win this war.
Later, while on a trip with Wilson throughout the Middle East, Crile began to realize the highly unusual nature of the CIA's Afghan war. George tells this story in a new book called Charlie Wilson's War. I am pleased to welcome my colleague George Crile back to this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
This is a great story. Subtitled Extraordinary Story, the Largest Covert Operation in History. You know a bit about this region. How did you first meet Charlie Wilson?
Well, I met him when I had read in the New York Times that the Afghan war had become the largest CIA operation in history, and there were no votes against it. No one was complaining, but it was just a tiny mention in a throwaway story. And I'd spent a lot of my reporting time covering the CIA, where everybody always opposes a CIA covert operation, and I thought it was like a news story. So just that fact, and I pulled off a commission from Don Hewitt at 60 Minutes and wandered out to Afghanistan. You can't cover a covert war, really. They're all hiding. Yeah. But they had this component, this AID kind of almost extension of the CIA program, humanitarian aid program, and I wanted to cover that as a way into this other one. And in my attempts to try to get somebody to open the door for me, I stumbled into Charlie Wilson's office and ran into a person who kind of looked like a buffoon. I didn't take him seriously.
Someone has said that you could come out of this story and paint him either as a hero or as a buffoon. It had those possibilities.
There's no way that this story ever could have, this whole experience could have happened had it not been for this brilliant cover that Charlie Wilson had, in which he looked like a buffoon. He never went to the front, to the jihad, without a beautiful woman by his side, a good Christian girl. He went to the Muslim lands once and vowed never to go back again without a lovely girl. And that was usually a former beauty queen, his own personal belly dancers. Yeah. But you know, that clip you showed there, what was interesting, and what I would only find out about a lot later, is that there were 8, that was the day after the Russians first withdrawal around the border, and the war was going, and there were, I found out later, about 8 Stinger teams, personally being there as Charlie's bodyguards. There was the IS intelligence service there, and in the hills there was Milt Bearden and the CIA station that were orchestrating the damnedest performance in which all of the weapons of the CIA had been brought out and blasted off in Charlie's honor. And I had no idea this was happening, but it was done as a kind of stealth thank you note.
When did you realize his connections, how wired he was in the region?
I knew that he was wildly influential as a funder of the war, and I knew that he had very good relations with the CIA, and they liked him. But the idea that he had actually managed to insinuate himself, the first outsider ever to do this, into the clandestine services, into the actual inner sanctum of the CIA, which runs these clandestine operations. I just never thought that was possible or that it had happened. And only after doing this story on this trip through the Middle East with him, where he brought along this guy who had retired, who was his co-conspirator.
Amazing character. A legend, not a legend, but certainly somebody that everybody at the CIA knew.
They probably knew, and you either liked him a lot or really didn't like him a lot.
Because?
Because he had a big, giant chip on his shoulders. He was oversized in his capacities. Yeah. He was brilliant.
A Greek American.
But he was the ethnic kid who felt odd man out. He had his nose to the glass, looking in. He was really the first of the ethnic kids to be brought in to the clandestine services, which used to be the preserve of the well-born Ivy League wasps. Yeah, and he was, and so he both loved and hated the place, and he was very impatient with the lawyers and with the bureaucrats, and he wanted to get on with the business of fighting America's enemies.
Tell me exactly what Wilson did and how he was able to do it with his colleagues in the CIA. How did he get all this money, $1 billion probably in the end, to finance a war which drove, because of American help from the CIA, drove the Soviets out of the country?
Yeah, a war which dwarfed anything that had ever been imagined at the CIA. Far and away the largest and most successful and most ruthless secret war the United States ever undertook.
And they never had that much money to do it with, did they?
Never. Anything. No one would dream of it. Among other things, they didn't want to be provocative. The whole idea of the CIA was to operate at that point, was to operate on the fringes and to deliver lethal blows. But first of all, it's not supposed to have been possible. That's just the bottom line.
And so how was it possible?
It was possible because, strangely enough, the potential was always there. The CIA, in fact, is no different than any other agency. It has to be funded by the Congress. If you have to be funded by the Congress, and it ends up by going to the Appropriations Committee and then to the Subcommittee on Defense, where there are 11 or 12 people sitting there deciding how much you get and how much you don't, as we all know, covering that world, it's possible to get a defense contract to have your whole district be almost weighted down by weaponry that's being made in your factories. You can have tremendous influence on regulations on everything, but nobody in the Cold War ever thought that it was appropriate or patriotic to cross the line and demand to have influence over the CIA. This was the president's preserve.
And how did Wilson do it?
He did it by being bold to the point of reckless, and by being completely underestimated at every turn as to his power and skill and consequences.
Underestimated because he was a flamboyant character. There's a tall, good-looking guy who dated beauty queens, who was frequently partying, who had been arrested for all kinds of motor vehicle.
You were in Washington at that time. He was famous.
Yeah.
He was operating in what he called the longest midlife crisis in history. He started his own bar. He had Jim Wright, the future speaker, ride white horses down Pennsylvania Avenue with him to go open this thing. Mayor Barry was his great, consorting partner. But what he was also...
That was one side. The other side was a guy who could manipulate the Congress to get the money, and a guy who had the connections with President Zia, Pakistan.
But it started with Israel. He acquired his power by becoming, as a freshman congressman, an absolute champion of the state of Israel, even though he was not Jewish. No Jews, so far as anybody can tell.
In his district.
In his district. But he just had this thing about any underdogs that were scrapping and willing to die for what they believed in. And so he really was helped a lot by the Jewish members of Congress, and was actually a member of the Jewish caucus. And he acquired a very keen understanding of how power works in Washington through the Appropriations Committee, in large measure through his work as a champion of the State of Israel. And then down the road, once he discovered Afghanistan, he put all of that to work, and he was just as bold as the Israelis are when it came to championing a cause that he thought was at the core of his John Kennedy call to arms. You know, he was part of that. Yeah.
I mean, but his mission was to do something in Afghanistan, and to be and to help his friend Zia.
Well, Zia came second. You know, his mission in Afghanistan all grew mystically. He was a man who was like Popeye. You remember when the damsel in distress suddenly transforms him, and he eats spinach and becomes just unnaturally powerful and skillful. And Charlie Wilson, whenever he confronted an underdog, like the Israelis and then like the Afghans and many others, he somehow transformed himself and learned how to use power boldly.
Tell me how you paint him. I mean, here's a guy who pushed, you know, who a lot of people would say, I have some problems with his ethics or his morality or any one of a number of things. You come at him in what way?
I came at him having, at every step of the way, having to look at him and all the people that were part of this epic story as figures who didn't belong in the ring of traditional foreign policy workings. They just don't belong. None of them do.
The guys at the CIA, the guys who were on his staff?
Well, it's that instead of secretaries of state and traditional leaders of the CIA or the NSC operating this thing, moving it as a driving force, instead of, for that matter, Reagan doctrine arch conservatives, it's this strange, scandal-ridden congressman who is, you know, alternatively ramming pedestrians on the Key Bridge and dead drunk, or being chased by Rudolph Giuliani for snorting cocaine, or allegedly snorting cocaine with two naked women. And
right. Let me take a look at this. This is another clip from your 1988 60 Minutes piece in which the late Pakistani President Zia talks about Charlie Wilson. Here he is.
There is a single man that has played a part which shall be recorded in history with golden letters. It is that Right Honorable Congressman Charles Wilson.
How was he able to accomplish or lead the United States into so much?
Again, a difficult question for me to answer. But all I can say is Charlie did it.
Why did most people are critical of the United States for abandoning Afghanistan after the Soviets were thrown out? Money still came. That's the first criticism. The second criticism is because of what Charlie Wilson did in arming the Afghans and their Mujahideen colleagues, it led to the conflict in Afghanistan, that led to the Taliban, that led to providing a haven for Osama bin Laden.
It did, and one of the strangest things I think about this story that I chronicled is that after 9/11, you know, you would think that it would be relevant to know that your government had very recently armed and supported and trained 150,000 Muslim fundamentalists that they came to call techno-holy warriors, so well trained that they had this range of weapons, sophisticated training, that maybe upwards of 500,000 had arms given by the CIA. These are fundamentalist Muslims, militant Muslims, who were our allies in this war against the Soviets, and including training in urban guerrilla tactics, terrorism, how to make pipe bombs, car bombs, how to move camel bombs, the whole business of what you do to break the will of a superpower. which they ended up doing. And so, the first thing you have to confront when you think about this is why, it's astonishing. This is a piece of our recent past that we've just never surfaced.
Charlie Wilson's alive and well, living in Washington as a lobbyist for the Pakistani government?
And I think other clients as well.
All right. I mean, how much did you get from him? How much did he participate in writing the book? I mean by that, how often would he sit for interviews and
Charlie was always dependent. For a while, he would go through periods where he would become very enthusiastic and cooperate, and then he kind of vanished. But the central thing is that Wilson was, from the beginning, fully cooperative, and so I was able to begin as a vehicle, the structure, to know his story, and then his co-conspirator's story, and then into all of the rival CIA people who sometimes didn't like either one of them.
And what's happened to Avracatus?
Avracatus he's retired. He's had a couple strokes, so he's not in great shape right now. But his story was sort of sad because he was always willing to stretch the rules to the absolute crazy breaking point and make his bureaucracy move in ways they weren't thinking of going or wouldn't want to. But when Iran-Contra came up, he had responsibility for it, and he did his very best to stop it and wrote these memos to Claire George, the operations director. And for that effort, he was basically moved out. And so he didn't get, in the end, to participate in the glory that all the other CIA people did.
The book is called Charlie Wilson's War, The Extraordinary Story of the Largest Covert Operation in History. George Crile, 10 years in the making?
Maybe 12.
Maybe 12. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.